everybody that's on the Zoom, submit your questions in the chat box. And I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Michelle Warmund, who's going to talk about phenoxy herbicide drift injury on tomato plants, how to recognize that, some of the things that she's learned from some of her studies. So kick it over to you, Michelle.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody sticking with us late in the afternoon, and this is not a very pleasant topic for most of us to address, but one that's certainly important. And so what I'd like to do during my time is just introduce you to some of the products, familiarize you with the symptoms and how to distinguish between some of the products, and then if you do get in a situation where you have exposure on some of your plants, maybe discuss some of the strategies that might be used. Whoops. Let's go back. Okay, so the auxin type herbicides, synthetic auxins include dicamba and 2,4-D, and they've been around for many, many years. Nothing new. They were first synthesized back in the early 1940s, and dicamba was, again, very old, first created back in 1942, but it wasn't released to the public as a product until 1965. Dicamba, while it has sort of a bad name among specialty crops, it is labeled for horticultural uses on lawns and also asparagus. But primarily it's used on row crops, specifically soybean and cotton are the ones we think most about today, but they can also be used on pasture land, conservation reserve programs, and so on. Now, the older formulations of dicamba were formulated as an ester, and those are very volatile and prone to drift. So Banville is one of the older formulations, and you can still buy that even as a homeowner. It's also used a lot on turf and golf course situations. It's often used in combination with a product called Trimec with a grass herbicide, whereas Banville controls broadleaf weeds. Now, the more recent products that are being sold and distributed since about 2017 are XtendiMax and Ingenia. Now, these products are primarily used for cotton and soybean, and they're formulated with an adjuvant or a compound, if you will, where they are intended to have less drift. So they have this drift reducing adjuvant included. So where you see XtendiMax with Vapor Grip, the Vapor Grip is what is intended to reduce the movement of the herbicide. Now, while they do reduce the amount of movement, it doesn't cease movement. So there still can be problems in certain situations. So there's been a lot in the press, unfavorable, about these products. And so the Missouri Department of Agriculture is the regulatory agency for these products, and all applicators must be licensed. And in addition to that, they must undergo specific training to use these types of products, the 2,4-D type product, which I'll talk about in a second, and then XtendiMax and Ingenia. Now, the other thing is that each and every time they use this, they're supposed to be checking the area and checking sites like DriftWatch, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, to make sure that there aren't sensitive crops in the area. And each and every time they make an application, even if it's daily, they must fill out a form this notice of application form, and it's online. So these records are kept for over years to track any applications of these products. And this is done through the Missouri Department of Agriculture. So let's move to the 2,4-D products. And again, there's a multitude of products that you can get on the shelves at a big box store, at your local garden center, that contain 2,4-D. And again, for broadleaf weed control. Now, again, the ones that we've been dealing with more on cotton and soybean, especially the transgenic ones, are Enlist 1, and that's 2,4-D alone, but it does have this Colex-D technology, which again is supposed to reduce the amount of off-site movement. And then Enlist Duo is the product that's 2,4-D plus glyphosate. So next, let's look at some of the symptoms. The pictures that I have here would be applicable to both 2,4-D and dicamba damage. The one thing about 2,4-D, the symptoms develop much more rapidly than with exposure to dicamba. So within 24 hours, you'll start to see on sensitive crops, especially tomatoes, you'll start seeing the bending of the stems and the twisting or malformation of the leaves and the leaflets. Usually for dicamba, it'll take 3, maybe 4 days before you start seeing any symptoms. Now, up here at the top, you can see, oops, maybe I should use that. Okay, you can see these adventitious roots. These are little root tips. When you get a very high exposure or drift episode, they'll burst through the epidermis or the surface layer of your tomato stems, and that's a symptom of 2,4-D or dicamba injury. Again, you'll see the bending and the twisting of the leaves, but down here you can see on these outer leaflets, which would be out here and out here, you see this very distinct, very pointed tip on those outer leaves, and that's a clear symptom of 2,4-D or dicamba damage. Now, also, if you get exposure during flowering or when the floral buds are actually present, then you can also get fruit abortion or flower abortion as well. Once your fruit is set, usually you don't see any abortion, at least of the fruit that's already set. Also, when you can get malformed fruit, and if you get exposure during that flower bud time, you can also get delayed maturity, so it'll take longer for the fruit to ripen, and it may be misshapen as well. Oh. Okay, so the greatest stages of sensitivity are, as I said before, is when you have those flower buds present at the time of exposure. And here, this is a dicamba injury right here. And then you can see at bloom stage, usually you'll get the flower abortion. Oops, I'm sorry, I must have skipped over. Yes, I'm sorry. Got trigger happy here. So with dicamba, the symptoms are very distinct. Usually you'll get a stunting of the plant, and on the primary stem, if the exposure is or the dosage is high enough, you'll get this clubbing, and then it'll stop the leaflets starting to form at that terminal site. So what happens then is when it's just like pinching a house plant. So when you kill or injure that main growing stem, it pushes out all the lateral growth or the side shoots, and so you get shorter, stunted plants, but they're very, very bushy. And I think we also see, okay. And in contrast then, skipping. There we go. Okay. In contrast, 2,4-D, a low dosage of that, especially a drift event, will actually stretch the plants out. And so you'll get longer internodes and they look, you know, a little stemmy, or like maybe they haven't had enough light. And the term for this is called hormesis. But anyway, it'll stretch out the plants. Okay, now we can go. Okay, so a couple years ago, we had been hearing some reports from some of our good extension folks out in the state and some of their growers, and they thought that they were seeing some differences among some of the cultivars. And how sensitive they were, and that maybe perhaps there were some that didn't express as much injury. So, but it was very difficult to tell because they were placed at different places in the field. We weren't sure of the dosages, and also we wanted to try to do a study to sort of parse some of this out. So our question was, do any of the commonly grown commercial tomato varieties have tolerance to 2,4-D or dicamba drift? So what we did is we grew 8 different, mostly determinate types. So these, again, are mostly commercial, for commercial growers, and we sprayed them at a rate of 1/200th the labeled rate for dicamba or 2,4-D, the labeled rate for transgenic soybean. So in a drift event, this would mimic real life conditions as best we could. So we sprayed when they're 9 inches tall and there were no visible flower buds. And this is important because, again, you know, we didn't want a lot of flower and fruit abortion. We wanted to be on the early end of exposure. Okay, so then after we sprayed, we separated the treatments because we didn't want to get any cross-contamination or volatilization of these herbicides. So after that, then we field planted them, and we also had a greenhouse study. But what I'm going to show you today are the results of the field planting. So we use typical practices. We planted them out in the field on white plastic mulch, use the stake and weave support system. We drip irrigated, alternated weekly with an application of calcium nitrate and master blend. So here you can see some of the damaged fruit that we harvested from the first couple of harvests. And these 4 varieties were showing very unique symptoms from exposure. The worst was Primo Red up here, and you can see that dicamba causes this elongated tip. This one was sprayed versus the untreated control. And I've had the question come up before that, well, you know, there are genes that control this, but not for this variety. That trait is not expressed. This was clearly what they call pistol tip, or this elongated tip, was clearly caused by the dicamba. For Red Morning, you can see here's a dicamba, and this was more typical of the herbicide damage. Usually we got elongated fruit. It honestly looked like a plum type tomato. And here you can contrast it with the non-treated control. Skyway was another one where this was 2,4-D damage versus the control. And then interestingly enough, the symptoms were different. The damage was different between the 2 herbicides on Celebrity. So dicamba on Celebrity caused the elongated tip, where 2,4-D, some elongation, but not so severe. So again, you know, the same type of dosage occurred, but expressing different symptoms. Okay, next then I'll show you the total yield. So this is, we harvested everything regardless of, and weighed it whether it was damaged or not. And first we wanted to see, okay, well, was there a yield reduction? And so let's first look at the controls and look at the differences between the varieties. So hitting the wrong button. Oh. So here at the top, you can see under the control, Florida 91 was our highest yielding variety. And again, not so much difference between Celebrity, Skyway, Primo Red, Red Deuce, or Red Morning. A little drop off with BHN 589. But Mountain Merit was clearly a dog in our trial. It was a very, very hot summer, and it just wasn't well adapted. And we did this study in New Franklin, Missouri, which is near Boonville, at our research station. Then when we look across, here you can see that no matter what the herbicide was, there was also always a reduction in yield when you compared to the untreated control for all the varieties except, of course, our dog variety with Mountain Merit. Now here we actually saw an increase, and this is again because of that stunting, and we got much more bushy plants, and so there are a lot more fruiting sites on those plants. So that's how we explain the increase in yield for Mountain Merit. Okay, now this is probably the most important slide. This is marketable yield. So for us to consider a tomato to be marketable, it had to be free of any blemish or any defect. It had to be at a medium size, which meant it was at least 3 ounces or 2¼ inches in diameter. So again, you can see Florida 91 yielded very well. And then, of course, here's our bad Mountain Merit down here. The other thing, again, every time we had exposure to a herbicide, there was a reduction in marketable yield. Also, when we looked at the compared dicamba damage versus 2,4-D, the damage was always worse with dicamba on Skyway, Primo Red, Red Deuce. Now, these are numerically lower than the 2,4-D here and here on the BH 589, but they weren't statistically different. But again, dicamba, sort of as a generalization, and when we've done herbicide drift studies on a lot of other ornamentals and also other food crops, fruit trees and so on, usually dicamba is causes more injury in general than 2,4-D when they have similar rates or dosages. So that's not uncommon. So when we look at just dicamba exposure, again, our top yielding variety was Florida 91. And when we look at 2,4-D, we still had good yields, or our top yields, I wouldn't say good, but they were reduced, but the highest yielding variety after exposure was Florida 91 and Red Deuce. So, you know, if I was a commercial grower and, you know, you never know which type of damage you may be incurring, you know, Florida 91 looks good. And this confirms what we had been hearing out in the state. We had heard from growers and some of our field staff that Florida 91 looked like it had less sensitivity. And so, again, this bears that out. Okay, so then it's one thing to have damaged plants, but then we need to be concerned about herbicide residue in the fruit. So in our study, we wanted to replicate our findings and all, and so to have enough fruit from all the varieties, we waited until 21 days after treatment. And what we found at that time, after spending thousands and thousands of dollars on residue analysis was by 21 days after treatment, we could not find any herbicide residue in the tomatoes. Now, the EPA sets tolerance levels for the amount of allowable residue that you can have in your tomatoes. So for 2,4-D, the legal limit is 50 part per billion. So if you're at 50 part per billion or above, that fruit must be destroyed. Now, there's been other studies done as well, and I think this is important to show you all how rapidly that the herbicide residue is metabolized or goes away, if you will, in the fruit. So in a couple other studies where they tested at some different dates, at 7 days after treatment, they had 50 part per billion, so that was non-saleable fruit, 10 part per billion, so it dropped rapidly by 2 weeks after treatment. So they actually could have sold that fruit. So next we look at dicamba. And unfortunately, EPA has not set any tolerance level for dicamba. And the way that this is, I think this is very interesting, the way the law is interpreted, because there's no tolerance level set, then it is assumed that there can be absolutely no residue, dicamba residue, or its metabolites present in the fruit to be saleable. So they're much more restrictive, even though, because there are no regulations or limits set. But again, in our study, 3 weeks after treatment, there was no residue detectable in the fruit. And just recently, a couple months ago, there's a new study published, and they found that, and this is comparable, this 1/200th dosage that we used in our study, by 7 days after treatment, they had 30 part per billion, so that would be non-saleable. 10 part per billion at 14 days after treatment, still non-saleable. And unfortunately, they didn't do a 3-week, but they did 40 days after treatment, and they found no residue. So again, and this has been found true in other crops that, again, dicamba, like 2,4-D, is metabolized very quickly in the fruit. But again, you're still losing yield during this time. So in our study, we would have lost at least the first 2 harvests, and we were harvesting twice a week. Okay, so we can say, to sort of sum up all this, that it is a very bad situation with tomatoes. They are highly sensitive. And the worst part is oftentimes we're setting out our tomato plants and they're at these very susceptible stages of showing flower buds or flowering at the very time that row crop farmers that are planting the transgenic soybeans are making these applications. So it's very, very risky, and there can be loss of crop and income to your tomatoes. The good news is, again, that the tomato plants will recover, and if you can stick it out, you can still make some money on the later harvested fruit. Then it's up to you, to determine what that residue level is in the fruit, and if you truly want to sell the tomatoes. Looking ahead, the future is rather bleak. XtendiMax and Ingenia, these are the dicamba products. They are registered, they have federal labels until December 20th, 2025. 2,4-D, even longer. Those labels are good until January of 2029. So this problem is going to continue on for the next several years. The good news is that if any of you are in Barton, Bates, Cedar, St. Clair, or Vernon counties, at least Enlist, the 2,4-D product, is restricted there. It cannot be applied in those counties. Okay, so what do we do if we suspect that you have injury? So the first thing, especially if you're a commercial grower, first thing you want to do is register your property and your crop on the Drift Watch website. And you can also post signs, but the commercial applicators that are applying XtendiMax, Ingenia, Enlist are supposed to be checking every time they spray to see if there are any sensitive crops in the area. Certainly, I would be proactive even before the growing season's too late now, but go talk to your neighbor, make sure that they're aware that you're growing a specialty crop, especially if you have tomatoes that are highly sensitive. Also, elderberry too are very, very sensitive as well. Those are probably, and grape would be the three most sensitive crops horticulturally. So post the signs. By law, and it depends on what product and the time of year and all, but they have to make sure that they have a buffer zone, and usually it's around 310 feet, a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on the situation, where if they're spraying, there has to be a buffer zone between their property and your property. So if you have enough land or enough area, try to set your most sensitive crops furthest away from where you anticipate injury might come from. Another thing to consider if you're a homeowner, again, it's expensive, but you can put up a fence. Something permanent like a wooden fence will help prevent drift damage, or if you have a more open type fence, you can use landscape fabric that's very tightly woven, and that will stop at least the particle drift from coming over on your property. Also, you can use construction grade fabric, but again, the tighter weave, this is superior because of the tighter weave than something that has even little teeny tiny holes. There's still drift that can come through there. Another thing to consider, again, if you have enough property, is to put in some sort of living barrier. And one crop that's been suggested, this hasn't been tested, but sorghum Sudan grass is something that you can get at your local farm store or MFA, and it grows very, very tall. And if you use a very high density, a very close spacing, it will help block that movement of the herbicide onto your property. It does grow tall, but the only problem, this may be better used more in the southern part of the state because you need to plant the sorghum Sudan grass when the temperature is over 60 degrees. So those soils in the southern part of the state tend to warm sooner than certainly the northern areas. Another thing that, again, it hasn't been tested, but in theory it should work, are, again, a living windbreak. And something like down here at the bottom where you use a row of evergreens and then some very densely planted shrubs, the thicket forming type shrubs, are best, again, to block the movement. And I do actually have some information. If you're interested, you can contact me about that. So the windbreak idea is expensive, but there is financial assistance that can be available from your local Natural Resource Conservation Service. They have offices in all the counties, and they have a specific program that's called EQIP, or the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And with this, they will help fund a windbreak as long as you can show that it's for conservation purposes. And so I visited with our local county guy, and he said certainly this would qualify for funding. But to do this, what you need to do is get started early and go to your county. You need plat maps, and you need to talk to your local conservation person in the office, and they will help you develop a plan. So usually it takes a while to get these together, and normally they consider all the applications in the fall. It's usually about November when they do this. They rank the applications for funding. And then if you rank high enough, then you can get financial support. Unfortunately, usually the grower pays the upfront costs, and then when they come back and approve it, and it's certified as meeting the conservation requirements, then they'll make payment. But I'm told by some conservation agents that there's a way around this where you can opt for an advance payment. So I haven't had experience with that, but I think it bears exploring that option. So next, if you suspect injury, you can report this. Again, the Missouri Department of Agriculture is the regulatory agency. They will not help you seek compensation, but they will help you file a report and take samples. So the first thing you can do is go online at this site right here, and there's an incident report form, and then you can request that they investigate. And they'll help take samples, they'll take video and pictures, and they will send it off for testing. Now they'll take foliage, soil, or water, but in the case of tomatoes or other horticultural crops, they will not take fruit. So you're on your own for sampling if you want to prove that there's residue in the fruit. Then they'll submit a report. So the most important thing is to document the damage. And this is a very long site there, but if you just Google responding to herbicide drift, and Ohio State University has a wonderful publication that will walk you through all the steps. But basically you need to photograph with a timestamp, or if you can't do that, if you're just taking with your cell phone or something, write on a piece of paper the date and include that in your photo. Record the date the damage was first noticed, the number of plants, the stage of growth or their age, all the varieties. So you would say, we had 10-inch tomatoes, they were at the bloom stage, and they were red deuce, big beef, and so on. So you need to do this as soon as you see the injury occurring, and I would take photographs at weekly intervals. Usually the maximum amount of at least vegetative or plant type symptoms are exhibited at 4 weeks after treatment. So you may not get all the damage the first week, and it'll continue to progress up until a month after the episode occurred. So usually what I do is I flag 4 or 5 plants, stand in the same place, and I take pictures and record my information that way. It's also very important to record the yield of your unaffected plants, but also if you're going to try to seek compensation for crop loss, you need to know what your crop loss was and what your normal expected yields are. But it's very, very important, and again, I would urge you to contact your local extension folks to help rule out any kind of insect damage, diseases, any nutrient deficiencies, water stress, things that are natural events, or maybe even misuse of something you've sprayed as well. For compensation, again, this is a tough one. I always encourage people to, go visit with their neighbor first. A lot of farmers will be carrying their insurance, but many of the policies do not cover what they consider pollution or drift incidents in their coverage, because drift is considered an act of God in many of these crop insurance plans. If you decide to pursue compensation, again, often if it's not very much damage, you can go through small claims court, but if you're looking at a major crop loss, it's best to contact an attorney, and not just any attorney, one that specializes in ag law. And then again, I think it's really important for you to take your own residue samples, because you don't know if MDA is going to come out and how long it will take for them to get the results back. So if it were me, I would look for an analytical lab that can do these residue analysis and contact them immediately, because there are some differences among labs on how they want you to collect the samples. It's best to use a pair of lab gloves when you collect your samples so you're not contaminating the samples. You can take about a quart size bag worth of plant tissue that looks damaged, label it with the date, the time, the crop, the location, and the person who did it. And again, if you're seeking legal compensation, it's best to have a third party do the sampling. And again, my extension colleagues out here won't like this, but it's best to involve them as a third party, a non-biased third party. So don't have your spouse be doing this, or Uncle Charlie. You want someone who's unbiased or not associated with your operation. Again, with some labs, you can freeze the samples and ship them on dry ice. When I do it, I use what used to be South Dakota Ag Labs. Now they're Matrix Sciences. It is rather expensive. 2 years ago, it was $162 a sample for either dicamba or 2,4-D. If you're looking for glyphosate, it's more expensive to 212, and I suspect with inflation that this price has gone up. But again, I take the samples, put them in bags, and I ship them by overnight mail and to this lab, so they don't require the dry ice. So that's, in a nutshell, what I have. If there are any questions, also feel free to email or give me a call if you have questions.
All right. If we have folks in the chat on Zoom, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the chat. Do we have any questions from the audience?
So why are some of those counties actually where you can't spray those particular herbicides?
Endangered species. So there's, they can be plants or they can be animals, whatever, but honestly, down in those counties, I'm not sure there's too much tomato production in those counties anyway, unfortunately. Other questions?
Hold on. Clement.
When you are traveling to the... Okay, sometimes, we travel to the southeast and you literally see the droplets on your windscreen. In that situation, do you, as a individual, what do you do about that when they are spraying all over the place? Yeah.
Well, the first thing I would do is, if I saw someone spraying, I would ask them to stop because clearly the wind, I'm guessing it's a windy condition and they shouldn't be spraying, more than, when I forget if it's 10 or 15 mile per hour wind. But clearly if it's blowing onto your property and you're seeing droplets, then yeah, I would go over and calmly, non-confrontationally, please, ask them what they're spraying and make them aware that, it's moving onto your property or onto your vehicle. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Does the misshapen fruit, you mentioned that, after certain days after treatment, the limit was down or 0 parts per billion, but does the misshapen fruit, does that also disappear as the... Okay.
Yes, it does. As in our study, by the third harvest, that we no longer were harvesting any of that fruit that had the pointed tips on it.
So my question's kind of along those lines. As far as how a farmer should proceed if they suspect a dicamba drift situation and they want to market the fruit from that planting, and recognizing there's no tolerance level, should they just plan to send off samples for analysis to make sure that there's nothing there, or should they assume they can't market the crop, or what would you suggest? It's a tricky situation.
Yes, and I think on a lot of these situations you have to do what you're comfortable with. In years past, the labs have been so swamped with dicamba and 2,4-D complaints and doing residue analysis. I know one year when I was doing peaches, it took me 6 months to get the results back. Now I think they've ramped up a lot, and it depends on what service that you use. It may be too late anyway, but again, if you're going to seek financial compensation for crop loss, then I would go ahead and do it. Certainly in the situations where you're not sure whether it's actually a herbicide drift problem, you could go ahead and freeze the samples and do your documentation and all, and see if it progresses and how much crop loss, or was it just the outer row. Maybe I can live with just crop loss on one row, but if it's going across my entire field, so I guess I would be proactive and maybe go ahead and take my samples and freeze them and do the documentation in case I decide to go ahead later and sue for losses. Does that answer the question?
Well, I guess it's more a question of, can I in good conscience sell the fruit?
So, yeah, and I think that depends on you. From what our data tells us, in most situations, by 3 weeks after treatment, usually it's dissipated in the fruit. But me personally, I wouldn't want to take that financial risk that someone would come back, one of my customers would come back and sue me. So
of course, they would have to prove that.
Again, yes, and that would probably take 5 years at least in a court battle. But again, it's what you're comfortable with. Mm-hmm. Are you willing to assume that kind of risk? Do you want to, potentially be selling bad fruit?
Well, it sounds like
contaminated fruit.
It sounds like it's an easier decision to make with 2,4-D.
Yes.
But boy, a tricky one to make with dicamba.
Yeah, and because of that 0 tolerance level. And the only way you're going to be absolutely sure is to do that residue test, unfortunately. It's sad. It's really because the burden of proof is on the grower.
All right. Well, thanks, Dr. Warman. Our Zoom participants, we're going to close the breakout room and you'll go back to the main session where we'll be talking about tomato fertility management and post-harvest tips. Thank you, Dr. Warman.